You want to give us the basics on this book here?
Give you the basics. Yeah, so can I say like sort of the genesis of it a little bit?
Absolutely.
Since we just mentioned that like Malcolm Gladwell's going to be here in the fall. And as I was telling you, I just was at a conversation with Malcolm Gladwell, and the way he introduced me was like, this is David Epstein, who devoted several pages of his first book to attacking my work.
So you've been making friends.
Yeah, and so the first time I ever met him was after my first book, where I critiqued the science underlying the 10,000-hour rule, and we got invited to a debate at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference to debate like athletic development, right? And he's like, he had a million things to do, and so when the student like called us to say like, let's have a debate call, he's like, yeah, no, we'll just show up and do it. And they framed it as 10,000 hours versus the sports gene, and so I'm like freaking out, right? Because he's super clever.
Mortal Kombat,
yeah.
like finish him.
So, yeah. So I tried to anticipate what his arguments would be, and I said, well, he's got to argue for early specialization of athletes, like he has to, because he's written and talked about it all over. So I said, okay, I'm the senior writer at Sports Illustrated. I think the science writer, at Sports Illustrated. I think I can go look at the science and see like, what do you know, across pretty much every sport, athletes who go on to become elite have what scientists call sampling period. They play a wide variety of sports, they gain these broad skills that scaffold later learning, learn about their interests, learn about their abilities, and systematically delay specializing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels. Not only that, but when you look at studies of, say, like soccer players that are matched for ability at a certain age and then tracked for several years, in certain periods of their life, the ones who have done like a wider variety of stuff are better at time too, right? And so I bring this up in the debate, and we called it the Roger versus Tiger problem, because like Tiger Woods was very early specialization. Roger Federer played a ton of different sports, didn't specialize until later than a bunch of his peers. And when we come off stage, he's like, you know what you got me on was that Roger versus Tiger thing. Like, you should write about that. And we became running buddies after that. Yeah. And we would talk about it, but I was so not ready to write another book that I just like filed it way back there, left sports, worked in ProPublica, reporting about totally different stuff. And then I was invited to go talk to the Tillman Foundation, to military veterans who were that got scholarships from the Tillman Foundation to career change. And I talked to them about late specialization in sports, and I'm like, well, I better tack on something about the wider world. So I do a little bit of research, tack on like 5 minutes of the talk about non-sports stuff, and they're like all over it, because they all feel so behind, right? So an ex-Navy SEAL who's, when he was there, was in grad school at Dartmouth and Harvard at the same time, sends me an email about how relieved he is because he feels so behind and he doesn't have like the right resume. And I'm like, the Roger versus Tiger thing came back to my head, and I was sort of like, maybe this could just be an analogy from sports that I use as a jumping off point for all these other domains, basically. And Malcolm and I were invited back, by the way, in March. And if you look at the video on YouTube now, he says, at the end, I now believe I conflated two ideas. The idea that a lot of practice is important, with the idea that means that in order to become great at X, you should start doing X and only X from as early as possible. And I now believe that's wrong. Mm-hmm. So I think like, he's like one of the people in chapter 10, the Foxes, who's good at updating his mental models, and I've appreciated that very much.
Yeah. Where do you think the balance is there? Because everybody acknowledges it's like practice is good, more practice is better, a little bit of practice is effective. Yet, like you said, there's a sampling period, and it's always good to kind of do some mental crop rotation.
Yeah.
So, like, how do you think we integrate the two theories? Because they're not really opposites.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think the way he's framed it now is actually very appropriate. And I actually think to some degree that's like with my first book, where I was sort of, when I was going around and pitching it, it's like, is it going to be nature or is it going to be nurture? And I'm like, well, that's not really, I came from a scientific background. Like, that's not really how it works. It's like, how much does nature nurture? How much of the variance in performance does it account for in each specific situation? It's never like an across-the-board phenomenon. And so I think that's the same with this, right? So one of the distinctions, sort of the frameworks I set up early in the book, is this, what the psychologist Robin Hogarth called kind versus wicked learning environments. Mm-hmm. So the kind learning environments are where next steps are clear, all the information's clear, patterns repeat, rules never change, you get automatic feedback that's accurate and immediate no matter what you do. Golf, right? Very kind environment. Chess, based on pattern recognition, which is why it's so easy to automate. The wicked learning environment is where there may be hidden information, feedback may be delayed, patterns don't repeat, tomorrow might not look like yesterday, that sort of thing.
So romantic love is a wicked environment.
Romantic love is a wicked environment.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah, this is one of the things I love about Eric, is he's such a good, there's a chapter on analogical thinking, and if you talk to Eric enough, like he'll start pulling analogies from all these other places that are super interesting. Yeah, so one of Hogarth's examples of the wicked environment was, really wicked environment is where feedback teaches you the wrong lesson. So he had this physician in New York City who would palpate patients' tongues, feel around their tongues with his mouth. Feel around their tongue with his hands.
Yeah.
That would have been worse.
Yeah, that's a Freudian slip. Okay.
So anyway, and he got really famous because he could predict that they would get, by doing this, he could predict they would get typhoid like weeks before they showed any symptoms.
Yeah.
And as one of his colleagues later observed, he was using only his hands, he was a more productive carrier of typhoid than even typhoid Mary, right? Because he was transferring it.
Yeah.
And the feedback was telling him that he was doing good jobs. That's a really wicked environment.
Yeah.
And so on the spectrum of kind to wicked,
I can predict my girlfriends are going to get gonorrhea? Okay. Wow, that stopped you.
Well, that would be accurate if you know that you're giving it to them, right?
Okay.
But so that took a left turn.
Okay.
No, so point being, the more toward the wicked end of the spectrum you're in, the less good repetitive experiences. So if you're in a wicked environment where you can't count on patterns repeating, then experience, and this is one of the things that like Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky showed, and before them this guy named Paul Meehl, who doesn't get enough credit, but there is no Kahneman and Tversky without Paul Meehl, found that repetitive experience in those wicked domains makes people more confident but not better.
Okay.
Right? So in golf, that repetitive experience makes you more confident and better.
Yeah.
And in these things where you can't count on patterns repeating, they make you more confident but not better. So I hope to kind of represent that in the book. It's like it really is domain dependent. Like specialization isn't bad. It's good if you use it in the right places.
So if you were going to, you've got so much in the book that's really interesting about learning, not only like the wicked learning environment, but also how we learn in terms of like gradual stuff. If you were going to teach a college class, how do you think that would be just structured differently than the average class that we're all used to?
You mean if I was going to teach, so just to pick something out, let's say I was going to teach like a math class.
Yeah.
Oh, can I just use that to segue into one of the studies that was the most surprising to me?
Yeah.
I can just go where I want to go.
Yeah.
Okay. And so one of the studies that I think captures a theme of the book that was also a study that I just found very surprising was done at the U.S. Air Force Academy, where, because there was a setup there that you would never be able to recreate with an experiment. And these researchers wanted to test the impact of teaching on the students. And it was such a great experiment because you have a freshman class come in every year of hundreds of students, or like 1,000 students, and they all have to take a sequence of 3 math courses, Calculus 1, Calculus 2, and follow-on course. And they are randomized to professors for Calculus 1, then they are re-randomized for Calculus 2, then they are re-randomized again. So you have this thousands of students over a decade that are being re-randomized as they're taking the same sequence of courses with the same exact test that's graded by committee, so there's no subjectivity in the grading. So you can really tell like how much teaching affects them. And they looked at 100 professors and thousands of students over a decade. And what they found was that the professors who were the best at promoting contemporaneous achievement in Calculus 1, their students overachieved compared to the characteristics they came in with in Calculus 1, then went on to systematically underperform in all the follow-on courses. So there was like almost an inverse relationship between how much they overperformed in Calculus 1 and then how they did in the subsequent courses. So out of 100 professors, the guy whose students did the 6th best, overperforming again compared to their characteristics in Calculus 1, they rated him the 7th best overall, finished dead last in how they then performed in all the follow-on courses. And it turns out that those professors, the way they promote contemporaneous achievement in their class is by teaching a very narrow curriculum, right? They impart what's called using procedures knowledge, where it's this kind of problem, like you execute these procedures. And that's really good for the short-term test. It causes this great short-term improvement. The students rate the teacher high, they rate their learning high, but because they're not getting this broader kind of knowledge called making connections knowledge, where you're attaching concepts to other broader concepts, when they then go on to use, to more difficult classes, they're undermined. So, like, what you want, instead of using procedures where you learn how to execute procedures, you want to learn how to match a type of strategy to the structure of a problem. And that's a longer term sort of development thing, and it gets to this classic research finding that I harp on a little bit in there called breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer.
Yeah.
Transfer, psychologists, the word they use to mean your ability to apply your skills and knowledge to problems you have not seen before, right? And if you want that, then the breadth of your training predicts how well you'll be able to do that, because the broader your training is, the more it forces you to build these conceptual models. And so I found this so deeply counterintuitive, but it became one of the themes of the book, that the things you can do to promote the quickest short-term improvement often undermine your long-term development.
It's really interesting. Can you talk about the research that was really interesting about how most of the college majors, it did, like, knowledge didn't carry over. I think, like, economics was one of the few.
Yeah. And this comes up a couple times, right, where students from different majors are given sort of critical thinking tests. And this one sort of luminary named James Flynn, if people have heard of the Flynn Effect, maybe, it's the rising of IQs around the world at about 3 points per decade over the 20th century. And specifically on the most abstract portions of cognitive tests, and on the most abstract tests where we were supposed to see the least change. Like the test that was designed for, like, if Martians landed here, it could test them, is the one where we've seen the most improvement. And it essentially, that's the topic of chapter 2, and it has to do with, like, how modern work has changed our thinking and made us more able to apply, like, abstract models across different situations. But he then wanted to see how well the sort of teaching in university was capitalizing on that ability and giving people critical thinking skills. And what he found was, I think the correlation he found between this test of critical thinking he made and college grades, I think it was 0.01. It was not quite 0, but it was like 0.01 or 0.02. And what he found was that students could not solve problems in anything except their major. But some majors did better than others. Like the econ majors did better. And econ is like a much more broader kind of conceptual field. But there's also one, can I just tangent onto one other? This is like how our conversations go. Like
like normally. We kind of get together, we talk like this, then we get apart, we do it via email, and then we come back.
But I don't usually dominate it this much, but I'm the author today, so.
I'll get you back.
Okay, so in chapter 5 is about using analogies for problem solving. And so I went and spent some time with a woman at Northwestern named Deidre Gentner, who's like the world's expert in analogical problem solving. And she came up with this test that, long story short, essentially asks students to identify the deeper structure of a problem, which turns out to be like the most important step to, like, people who aren't good at problem solving start by trying to execute procedures, and people who are expert problem solvers start by trying to identify the structure of the problem, basically. And so she'd give these problems across all these domains and see who could, like, identify the structures of the problems. And students were not bad at it in their major. But the only students that were good at it across a bunch of disciplines were these students who had no major, who were in this program called the Integrated Science Program, where they had no major, they just dabbled in all these different things. And that gave them these broad conceptual skills, right? And so she finds these are the best problem solvers. Then I go around Northwestern and ask other faculty how they feel about the Integrated Science Program, and they're like, not good, those kids are getting behind. So I'm like, here you have, in your faculty, the world's expert in this kind of problem solving, saying, here are the students we're doing the best job with, and you're like, not good, those kids are getting behind. And I'm like, maybe there's no hope, actually.
But what's interesting is, going back to what you said about the Tillman Foundation, like, I think that was something. Can you talk about, there's a lot of hope in this book, in terms of, like, 10,000 hours is intimidating. 10,000 hours, deliberate practice is hard. Like, a lot of people feel like, oh, well, then I guess I'll never be an expert. And it's like, you know, this creates a range of possibilities. It's like, can you talk a little bit about that, those hopeful factors, how people responded?
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? So people often think about, even Anders Ericsson, who really did the work that led to the 10,000-hour rule, if you look at his book, Peak, he basically says, like, in an offhanded way, like, by the way, all this stuff only applies to fields that are very well developed and, like, based on certain types of repetitive things, and where a coach can tell you exactly what you should do. Kind of like, okay, so that limits it to, like, golf and chess and, like, 2 other things.
Yeah,
basically.
not my life.
And, you know, what I found, so one of the projects that really resonated with me, and that I think probably did with you, was this one called the Dark Horse Project, this research in the book where it wasn't named that at the beginning, but these researchers at Harvard were trying to find, how do people find work that they find fulfilling, basically. You know, maximizing their match quality, the term economists use to describe the degree of fit between someone's interests and abilities and the work they do. And they started bringing these people in for these sort of introductory like screenings, and finding that they would all say like, well, just make sure, don't tell people to do what I did, because I started on this other track, didn't like it. Then I tried this other thing, didn't like that, and sort of zigzagged and kind of like designed my own thing and like became an entrepreneur.
A crazy alien exception.
Yeah. And so they'll be like, so that was really lucky. Like you wouldn't want to tell people to follow that path. And then they realize like something like 90% of the people would say stuff like that, and that they viewed themselves as having come out of nowhere. That's why they named it the Dark Horse Project, because all these people, not all of them, the large majority, did not follow this sort of linear career path, and instead sort of did this zigzagging, which makes a lot of sense to me after doing more of the research for this book. Like another woman whose work in the book really resonated with me was Herminia Ibarra, who basically does the same thing. How do people find work that fits them? Which is really important, because it turns out that when people find work that fits, I like to say this saying, like, when you find fit, it looks like grit, basically, because when people find a good fit, they display all these characteristics that are associated with grit anyway. And she had this phrase I loved: we learn who we are in practice, not in theory. And what she meant was, she looked at all this research and found we're actually not that good at just introspecting about like what our potential talents and interests are. We actually have to try stuff and then reflect on it, and that's how we start to triangulate our interests and abilities. And so it's not really surprising that these people had to zigzag because...
Ready, fire, aim.
Yeah, exactly. That's she would say like act and then think. Because we learn who we are in practice. Right? You have to actually do stuff and then reflect on it. And we're not as good as I think a lot of like this sort of guru industry might suggest at just introspecting and like going forth and flowering.
Well, while you're beating on sacred cows like 10,000 hours, it's like talk about grit as well.
Yeah. So, and I want to say, so I'm big on this sampling period, right? We were just talking about this. I just want to say people have heard of grit, right? Angela Duckworth's Grit, super famous. And the day before this book came out, her weekly newsletter was titled "Summer is for Sampling," right? The day before it came out. This could be a coincidence, but I doubt it. So there was an article off that newsletter the next day in Quartz that was like, Angela Duckworth is suggesting taking a generalist approach. And by the way, there's a book coming out about generalists. So, and she says in the newsletter, like, I took a decade of bouncing around before I knew what I wanted to do, and that's when I applied my grit. And so if the idea is work really hard when it makes sense, I'm like, I'm all for that. You know? But some of my critique of grit in this book, to her and her colleagues' credit, comes straight out of their papers and just got lost in translation to the public, because I think their papers are really honest in many ways. And so for example, the most famous grit study was done on cadets entering the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And the grit survey is a 12-question survey. Half the points are awarded for resilience, half the points for consistency of interests. And that survey turned out to be a better predictor of who would get through beast barracks, this like rigorous 6-week orientation, than were the more traditional measures known as the whole candidate score, test scores, athleticism, all this stuff, which is good to know. But the vast majority of cadets get through anyway. And the importance of grit is exaggerated because of what statisticians call restriction of range problem. So you've taken, if this is like the spectrum of humanity's whole candidate score, you've taken this and enrolled them, and so you truncate one of the variables, which makes the other ones look exaggerated. So that's the first issue. And so an example like that I liken this to is if I did a study of what causes basketball skill, used only centers in the NBA as my subjects, and concluded only practice got them to the NBA, not practice plus being 7 feet tall. Because I've truncated one of the variables. And in fact, when I did this data analysis for my first book, there's a very high positive correlation between points scored in the NBA and height in the American population of men. But if you restrict your range to only people who are already in the NBA, it reverses and becomes negative. So if you don't acknowledge the restriction of range, you'd give parents the advice to have short kids to have them score a lot of points in the NBA. Right? So, but the next point about the grit study, it's a 6-week, and they say in their study, they're like, because of the way these people are pre-selected, you cannot extrapolate these results to other places. You know, the other studies, it's people who are already in the finals of the National Spelling Bee. So you've pre-selected people for a very short-term goal, right? And life is not a 6-week orientation. So if you take a longer view and look at these cadets later on, right, and the point of these cadets is to become the future leaders of the Army, since the dawn of the knowledge economy, about half of them are dropping out on the day they are allowed, right, from the Army. And that's a new phenomenon. And so at first, the Army said, like, well, I guess millennials have developed a grit problem, right? Even though these people got through beast barracks and got through the military academy. And so a high-ranking Army official suggested defunding West Point because he called it an institution that taught its cadets to get out of the Army, right? Probably not.
No.
And so a group of officers and scientists decided to study this for the Army Strategic Studies Institute. And what they found was that they hadn't developed a grit problem, they had developed a match quality problem, where almost overnight, where they were structured very hierarchically, up or out career tracks. And that was great when we were in an industrial economy where organizations were in kinder environments. Work didn't change as quickly. They could count on facing the same problems tomorrow as yesterday. And so, like, firms were highly specialized.
Yeah.
And so there were incredible barriers to lateral movement.
Fighting the last war was a good thing.
Yeah. And when the knowledge economy opened up and suddenly you have a premium on these more conceptual skills, knowledge creation, broad problem solving, and there's a ton of lateral mobility, the highest potential officers. So the chances of someone dropping out as soon as they could was directly proportional to how much money the Army had given them. The more likely the Army was to identify them as high potential and give them scholarships, the more likely they were to drop out as soon as they could. So the higher potential, the more they saw, like, I've got these other options, these other interests, I'm not maximizing my match quality in the Army, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And so first they tried to throw money at these people, and the people who were gonna stay took it, people who were gonna leave left anyway. $500 million taxpayer money down the drain. And I guess that's probably like couch cushion change for the Army, but it's still $500 million. Then they started these other programs, like one called talent-based branching, where instead of saying, here's your career track, get up or out, they say, we're gonna pair you with a coach, here's a bunch of different career tracks, try this one, the coach will help you reflect on how it fits you, then try this other one, this other one, this other one, and we'll keep triangulating where you fit. And by giving people some agency over their match quality search, they had much better retention than throwing money at people. And so there's always going to be some barriers to lateral movement in the Army, of course. So they can't like mimic the wider economy, but they started creating more of a talent market internally, and they've had better retention with that. Because when you get fit, it looks like grit. Those gritty people who made it through beast barracks didn't suddenly lose their grit. They suddenly realized they could have better match quality outside of the Army.
So it's really interesting because so much of grit, it turns out, is actually explained by like the big five factor of conscientiousness. And then, you know, your book, you spend a lot of time talking about one of the other big five, which is openness to experience, and you know the issue of openness to experience and curiosity, which seems to have a crystal ball-like ability when you're talking about foxes and hedgehogs. And can you talk a little bit about the ability, that prediction quality?
And by the way, you shared with me, I hope this isn't like too private, but that you're like in the like 99.99th percentile of openness to experience, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, the foxes and hedgehogs. So this is, chapter 10, I think, encapsulates some of the work that's had the biggest influence on kind of my own thinking over time. Yeah. And this is the work primarily of a guy named Philip Tetlock, also influenced by Paul Meehl, by the way, who's I think he's like this foundational thinker that like doesn't get the credit he deserves.
Well, now he does.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
That's right. So when I quote Kahneman in the first chapter telling me that a certain book in the 1950s impressed him enormously in Liddell's work. It's Meehl's book called Clinical versus Statistical Prediction, where he showed that in all of these fields that involve any kind of human behavior or like human responses to things, experience was making experts more confident but no more accurate. Yeah. And so Tetlock's work, he was a young professor in the 80s, and he was noticed, specifically when he was on this important committee about US-Soviet relations, and he's like by far the most junior member. And he notices that these experts are making very confident, authoritative predictions about what's going to happen with the US and the Soviet Union, and they're often mutually exclusive and totally impervious to counter-argument. And so he sort of says like, well, somebody's got to be right and somebody's got to be wrong, so I'm going to test this kind of judgment. And he realizes that in order to test judgment, first of all, he has to have people make concrete predictions, right? So he's done this stuff where he surveys, like when someone on the news says, it's very possible that this could happen. Like, what percentage do people think that means? And very possible means like from 20 to 80, like depending on who you ask, right? So they use all this ambiguous language. There was a Paul Krugman column about something having to do with the Eurozone, where he has this like kind of bombastic sentence, and then it says, and my prediction, and my answer is, definitely maybe. And you're like, okay. Yeah. So he had to have concrete predictions with deadlines, And he had to have tons of them because you have to separate lucky and unlucky streaks.
Yeah.
So the project lasted 20 years, 82,000 probability predictions, with a scoring system that scores people for how far out. They can update every day, but the farther out you're more accurate, the more points you get. And what he found was that experts were horrible forecasters of political and economic trends, basically, but that a small portion of the people in the study kind of bucked that trend. And these are what he called the foxes. So he borrowed these terms from a philosophy essay. The hedgehog knows one big thing, and the fox knows many little things. Yeah. And the people who bucked that trend of being horrible at prediction were these people who basically had these incredibly broad interests and would aggregate perspectives. So he described it as they have dragonfly eyes. Dragonfly eyes are composed of thousands of lenses. They each take a picture and it's integrated in the dragonfly's brain. And so they would go around collecting perspectives and try to integrate it. And they would struggle with this. Like, they never felt good about it. And the hedgehogs were often people who had spent their entire career working on one problem. And they would apply the model they had developed to anything in the world. And they knew so much. And the hedgehogs, the deepest, most specialized hedgehogs, got worse as they accumulated experience and credentials. Right? It turned out that as they knew so much, they could fit any story to their one model.
They were rationalizing.
And in some cases, the hedgehoggiest hedgehogs, who had spent like their entire life studying one problem, they not only got worse as they accumulated credentials, but when they were like anti-Bayesian. So if people are Bayesian here, you know, it's like you should be updating, when things happen, you should update your mental model statistically. And some of those people, when they would make authoritative and incredibly wrong predictions, right? So the most decorated experts, when they said something was impossible, it happened about 15% of the time. And when they said something was a sure thing, it didn't happen about a quarter of the time. And when they would go wildly wrong, and you would go back to them and ask about their confidence in their models, they would update in the wrong direction, saying they become more confident of the models that sent them astray, which is like makes sense according to nothing.
Yeah.
Like, and he was so interested in this that it was these like broader people that he decided to look for them in the general public and realized that you could just find these people who had no expertise, who were just like really widely read. Yeah. And eventually, IARPA, which funds research on the U.S. intelligence community's most pressing challenges, notices his work and says, all right, we're going to host a prediction tournament about like geopolitical events. And the questions are really hard. It's like, what is the chance before a certain date that there will be a clash in the East China Sea that has at least 10 casualties? Like, they're difficult questions. And so in the IARPA tournament, there's a bunch of university teams, and then there's the intelligence community, and they can all arrange however they want. And Tetlock and his wife, Barbara Mellers, who's also like an eminent scholar of decision-making, decide to just make a call for volunteers. And they screen them for this sort of foxiness, this wide-ranging interests, and then they have them start predicting, and then they take the best of those, and they put them on teams of 12. And they blow the doors like off the CIA, basically, right? They don't have access to classified information, and they beat a market, like a prediction market, a wisdom of the crowds market of intelligence analysts by 30%, right? Tetlock would always say by classified margins, but then it leaked in somewhere. So now he'll say like a report. If you look at this report, you know, and so now, like, you know, the intelligence community is sort of engaging them, but it turned out to be these people who just have these incredibly wide interests, and they will use experts. Specialists are important. They will use them for information. They just won't take their opinions. But I do think specialists are important. Like, I like how Freeman Dyson, the physicist and mathematician, styled this. He said, we need both birds and frogs. The birds are down in the mud, seeing all the details. The frogs are up above, integrating the knowledge. The birds are up above, integrating the knowledge of the frogs. That would be a very special frog. Sometimes my mouth moves faster than my brain. And what he said the problem is, he said we need both for a healthy ecosystem. The problem is we're telling everyone to be frogs and no one to be birds, and it makes us like very rigid, and we don't have this perspective aggregation.
So well, you talked about, like, you know, because in politics especially, like, being a flip-flopper is this bad thing, and you said that, like, you know, it's like the research showed, it's like flip-floppers are actually the best predictors.
Yeah, right. So the worst predictors were the people who are like on TV, right? Because it turns out that seeing everything through one lens makes you able to be very authoritative about your predictions, which makes you really good on TV, but also makes you a horrific predictor. And so as Tetlock, he uses like very diplomatic language. He says, there was a curiously inverse relationship between prominence and accuracy. Yeah, so they flip-flop. So one of the kind of heuristics I keep in mind that he found from his research in looking at conversations. So the best forecasters, when they were put on teams of 12, they became 50% more accurate in their individual predictions. So something about them being together made each other better. And when he looked at all their conversations, and he let me see some of their conversations, one of his takeaways was they use the word however a lot more than the word moreover. Whereas the hedgehogs do moreover. They're like this, and moreover this. Yeah. And the foxes are like, I think this. However, if like this was your idea of a good world and this is what you think about human nature, you'd actually see it this other way, right? And so they flip-flop like crazy. Yeah. So these people who are uniquely good at, have uniquely good judgment will like fail in politics because they flip-flop all the time. And that's like what you get punished for as a politician.
And you talked about, what was it, the principle of limited sloppiness?
Oh, yeah. That's a principle by Max Delbruck. I loved in both of my books, the last chapter was the one where I sort of started having fun. The rest of it is like grinding and like trying to organize the information. And then the last one is sort of fun. And so the principle of limited sloppiness, this was a Nobel laureate who basically said, if you're too kind of controlled in what you're doing, you miss all these, like most of the biggest findings of science have actually come from something that like someone wasn't exactly trying to do. It's like something came up that was strange and they're like, maybe my equipment's calibrated wrong, and then they start to realize it. So, and he's like, so if you never have room for this sort of uncharted experimentation or making mistakes, you'll actually miss a lot of the most important stuff. Yeah. And I was using that in the context of one of my favorite interviews, who was Oliver Smithies. Smithies, who passed away not long after I interviewed him, was a Nobel laureate who would do what he called Saturday morning experiments, where the University of North Carolina, very helpfully for me, digitized all 150 of his notebooks. Wow. And he would notice all of his breakthroughs come on Saturdays. And he would say, he told me, he's like, yeah, people ask why I came to work any other day. And on Saturdays, he said you could go and be not rational. Like you could just go in the lab and goof around. Yeah. He would still take notes, but he didn't have to, weigh things properly, and so he'd mess around. That's where he always made his breakthroughs. And he was very playful. Like when he was younger, he was trained to be a doctor at first, and then he went to a chemistry lecture and was like, that's cool, I want to do that. And so then, as he said, I wasn't afraid of biology and I wasn't afraid of chemistry. He became molecular biochemist, which now is its own specialty, but at the time was like this bold hybrid, like, whoa, you're mixing these things, right? So sometimes the things that were these hybrids become their own specialties. And his colleagues noticed this playfulness where he would like to try to goof around with any equipment. So when equipment got broken or outdated, they would leave it with the label NBGBOKFO, which meant no bloody good but okay for Oliver, because he would just go play with the stuff, right? And he took a sabbatical when he was 54 to go 2 floors away in his own building to learn how to, so he'd been, biology, chemistry, then he decides he wants to learn to work with DNA, goes 2 floors away, and at the age of 60 publishes the work that wins him the Nobel Prize, now as a geneticist, which he started picking up in his mid-50s, right? And so a lot of the people in the book are these sort of later bloomers, right? Yeah. And can I say something else about the late bloomers?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm making it real hard on you.
I mean,
so
I may need some water. I'm talking too much.
So I was at this a Motley Fool event. It's like this investment site, and they took something from the introduction where they put a poll up on the screen for the audience to vote on their cell phones. It said, what do you think is the average age of a founder of like a blockbuster tech startup on the day of founding, not when it becomes a blockbuster? 25, 35, 45, 55. 25 was by far the favorite, and then it just descended in order. And the answer is actually 45 and a half, right? As this is research from the Census Bureau and MIT and Northwestern. But like, just like the Tiger Woods story, when Mark Zuckerberg at 22 says like, young people are just smarter, that's the thing we remember, not the data that like these people actually usually have to zigzag a bunch before they even know where the territory they should compete in is. And so I think that Oliver Smithies' trajectory is actually not so abnormal.
Yeah. And so in terms of making those predictions, even in our personal lives, it's like, you talk about a bias, a cognitive bias we sort of have with the end of history illusion, which is really interesting. Can you talk about that? That was really cool.
Yeah. The end of history illusion is this psychological finding that at every stage in life, if you give someone a psychological survey, they're like, yes, due to my experiences and everything in the past, I've changed a great deal. But now I'm pretty much done, right? Now I'm pretty much a finished product. So at every time point in life, we recognize we've changed a lot in the past and underestimate by a lot how much we're going to change in the future on like values, on core personality traits, all these sorts of things. And it leads to like really funny results. Like if you ask people, how much money would you pay today to see your favorite band right now in 10 years? The average is $129. And if you ask them, how much would you pay to see your favorite band from 10 years ago today? The average is $80, right? Because we underestimate how much our taste will change. And it turns out that this is like important. So this issue of match quality has to continue through your whole life of finding like work that fits you because you change a lot. And the period from 18 to your late 20s is the period of most rapid personality change in your life. And that's usually when we're telling people like, you gotta find your thing, right? And so you're telling them that at a point where they are trying to choose for a person they don't yet know in a world they can't yet conceive. And so maybe they'll get lucky, but probably not.
Well, you talk about the sampling period in terms of the Roger Tiger issue, but sampling period is also really important in terms of career as well. The great quote on flirting with your possible selves.
And again, that was, came out of conversation with Herminia Ibarra, where we started talking about like, basically, because I love her work, and it resonated very deeply with my own progression. And we started talking about like, if people looked at careers like dating, we'd never tell people to like settle down that quickly with that little information. And yet you spend like as much or more time with your work as you do with your spouse, right? And, for some people, like it may work out to marry their high school sweetheart or whatever. But for most people, that's probably in retrospect going to look like a bad, proposition once they learn a little more about the world. And so it sort of dovetails with this study of an economist who found this natural experiment in the English and Scottish school systems in higher ed, where they're very similar, except the English students have to specialize earlier, like in their teen year to mid-teens to decide what program they're going to apply to in college. The Scottish students can sample longer. And he wanted to know who wins the trade-off, the early or late specializers. The early specializers do jump out to an income lead. They get more domain-specific knowledge. The late specializers have better match quality, so they have faster growth rate when they get out. They erase the income gap quite quickly. And then the early specializers start quitting their career tracks in much higher numbers, even though they have more disincentive from doing so because they've sunk more into it. So the late specializers end up winning on both counts more often.
So it's really interesting when you talk about the issue in terms of like personal choices and people who aren't as open. It's like at the end of the book, you do spend a little time talking about how people can like bigger horizons. What should people do to take advantage of what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, my approach. So when I was a competitive runner, I used to keep a journal, training journal, and I transitioned that into my professional life when I got out of running, and I found that it did not work well. The way it worked in running, like life wasn't like that, with the goals as concrete and the situation as clear and like stopwatch.
Life's more wicked.
Yeah, definitely. And so over time I changed and sort of learned from some of this research, and instead I keep a book that's more like the one I kept when I was a science grad student, which is a book of experiments with the hypothesis about what I want to learn, or what interest I want to explore, what I think is going to come out of it, and then I go and reflect on like how that experiment worked, basically. So my approach is much more like the Dark Horse Project people, which is when we were doing the interview, they asked me like, maybe you should be a subject in this thing, because I was like living in a tent in the Arctic when I decided to become a writer for sure. And those dark horses, their main trait was, I don't want to say the anti-grit, but like it was not worrying about where you're going to be in 10 and 20 years. It was this short-term planning where they would not look around and say, here's who's younger than me and has more than me, but say, here's who I am right now, here are my interests and skills, here are the opportunities in front of me, I'm going to try this one, and maybe a year from now I'll change because I will have learned something about myself. And they just keep doing that until they get to a spot. So that's the approach that I take. And I literally have no idea what I'm going to do next. None. But I'm less worried about that, partly because of the research that went into this book, but and also because I wrote this book, I feel like it's less embarrassing to say, too. I can be like, I'm just living by what my book said. But
well, hey, I wrote a book about success, and if it didn't do well, that was really not going to like prove my theory. This guy does not know what he's talking about.
Well, you know, man. But I realize in retrospect, like all of my most important projects have come from me reacting to opportunities, not to anything that I ever planned. When I was a teenager, I was sure I was going to go to the Air Force Academy, be a test pilot and astronaut. Did none of those things. I've gotten almost linearly less like long-term goal directed, and all my most important projects were nothing that I ever planned, basically. And so now I don't worry about that.
Well, you talk about, I mean, I think, which is really relevant, you look at all the things in terms of social psychology, the importance of context, and you talk about how context is really important in terms of this stuff, like when we were talking about that issue of like match quality sampling, it's like, can you talk a little bit about how context affects us and how important it is?
Yeah, so this is, I think you're referring to this work that I kind of saw as a bridge in the person-situation debate in psychology, where the person-situation debate is, to put it like very crudely, is are the traits of your personality like an innate part of you that doesn't change, or are they a function of your context? So that one would be the situation, the other one would be person. And there are extreme ends of that argument. But now there's a number of different areas of work that are building a bridge between those. And one of them is this work that's finding what's called if-then signatures, where it's like, if David is at like a giant party, then he's an introvert, right? Which is true. If David's like at work with his small team, then he's an extrovert, also true. And it turns out that people have these signatures that are often consistent for a certain time. They're like consistently inconsistent, right? They're different in different contexts, but that signature travels to some degree with that person. So it's like you don't really know what you're, like, so this idea of, even with something like grit, where it's just like, this is how you will be in every situation. Like, you should be very careful about extrapolating how you'll be in a certain situation. And this was part of Kahneman's whole career, was spawned when he was in the Israeli military and was tasked with watching people, him and other people were tasked with watching people do military exercise and identify who's going to be the leader in common, and realizing that they sucked at that, right? Because the people who looked like the leaders, and the cowards and whatever in one situation would totally be different when they got into a different situation. And so that was like spawned all of his work. So I think we don't really know until we've tried ourselves in different contexts.
Well, so then it really fits in. It's like a lot of these traits, like grit, like it's less of a global personality trait, and that's why, like you said, it's like we need to do and then learn from it, as opposed to all this hypothesizing, which also fits into, you look at statistics. It's like it's like, be careful with your theories. Get a big sample size as opposed to a small sample size and having big theories. That's not how it works. I mean,
no, exactly. And I think some of that's lost because of the way we in social sciences, because of the way averages are used, right? They squash a lot of the individual variability. One of my initial problems with the 10,000 hours research was it didn't include any measures of variance. I'm like, I came from geology grad school. You can't get something published without measures of variance. Like, what is this? So I contact the author. I'm like, what are the measures of variance? He's like, I don't know. It was like they were inconsistent on different attempts, so it doesn't really matter. I'm like, wait, we all struggle to get good data. That doesn't mean we don't include measures of variance. Can I get a ballpark? And he was like, well, when we have video training diaries that can find people, that'll be relevant. And I'm like, more or less than 500? He says, definitely more than 500 hours. So I'm like, come on, man. Like, that's not how this works.
No, it's like scrubbing the outliers versus maybe we should be studying the outliers.
So then I started looking at papers and expertise that did include measures of variance, like it takes 11,053 hours on average to become an international master in chess, one step down from grandmaster. So the 10,000 hour rule would be short on that one. But some people have made it in 3,000 hours, and some people finished the study at 25,000 hours and still haven't made it. So what does the 11,053 hour rule really tell you? Not much.
So I'm curious. It's now I got 2 books. So how do you feel that Sports Gene and Range agreed? Like, where did you learn something? Where did they diverge?
I think the most important agreement is that it actually is important to explore your talents, and that your fit, and that it's sometimes the most important talents. So one of the most interesting things for me from the Sports Gene was this idea of trainability, where you would see these studies where a large group of people and families, one of them, every member of 2 generations of 98 families are put on 6 months of cycling training to see how much they can improve the amount of oxygen they move through their bloodstream. Very important predictor of endurance. And you see this incredible variation, like more than 10-fold variation among people that did the same exact thing. So in many cases, the variation is getting wider after everyone does the same training than it was before they did it. And not only that, but the correlation between ability at baseline and ability to improve in that study, that's one of the most famous exercise science studies ever, was 0.
Yeah.
So on day 1 of the study, the scientists, essentially said, here are 10 most talented people, because they did a baseline test. Missed 100% of the people who ended the study looking the most talented because of the differential training effect on people. So how different of a concept of talent is that than what we're used to? Like, you have to actually experiment with training to see what you respond to. And so all of these things mean that you have to like sink some time in learning about yourself, which is not like what people want to hear, that you have to invest some time in experimentation, but it has a huge return on investment.
So along those lines, what else would you, like, what concrete advice would you give people in terms of like coming from sports gene where you had like, great concepts like the Big Bang of body types, different people, physically, right? And here, range, different people have different abilities, and exploring those abilities can get you a better match. What concrete advice would you give people in terms of, moving forward?
Yeah, and those abilities, a lot of the ones I talk about in range are not as easy to measure as some of the things that are measured in sports and the sports gene. So the only way to go about it is like by trying stuff. Yeah. And so if I had to leave with one word, and I'm stealing this from this scientist, when I steal people's language, I try to cite them. Yeah. Like, especially if it's a female scientist, because people already don't like cite their, dudes like already don't cite their stuff enough. Yeah. So Mariah Elfrink Gemser, I asked her this question. She studies self-regulatory learners in sports and school and all this stuff. She's in the Netherlands. And self-regulatory learners are the people who they like get off plateaus. They don't stick on plateaus of learning. And they kind of take accountability for their learning. And I asked her, if there was like one word, what is it that they do different? And she said reflection. She said they learn more from everything they do because they reflect on what it taught them about themselves and themselves. And so you can even see in like some of the youth soccer players she tracks from like age 8 up to the pros, their assessment of their own strengths and weaknesses will start to converge with what the coaches think. Whereas the people who do less of that reflection, less self-regulatory learners, they seem not to self-assess very well, and they don't get better at it over time. So if I had to leave with one word, it would be try stuff, right? Experiment. Like, you don't have to take a flying leap into new work. As Herminie Ibarra's work suggests, like, you can't do that because identity, your work is part of your identity, and identity doesn't change overnight. It changes one tiny piece at a time. And so set up some of those little experiments and then make sure to reflect on it. Like, make sure you get the maximum lesson out of what you're doing. And to me, like, pursuing match quality is a lifelong thing. It's not like I get to a point and I'm like, I'm finished. Like, I'm always going to be a work in progress. Yeah, and so you talk a little bit about teams as well, where it's like, that's not, there's a science there where it's like, what makes a good team? You talk a little bit about how that, when we're interacting with others. Yeah. And so, well, we talked a little bit about like in the teams of good predictors, right? Are these people who view all their ideas as hypotheses in need of testing, essentially, where they're not things that they hold tight to. And so teams come up in a couple different places. So it sort of depends where we're looking. So let's say in some of the patent research here, because what a generalist and a specialist even is like subjective, except in some areas of research, it's defined in a certain way. So like in patent research, it's defined by the number of different technology classes that someone has worked in. There's 450 different classes in the patent office. And what you would see is that the more uncertain a field was, so fields were more characterized as more uncertain if they had lots of patents that were totally useless and some that were total blockbusters. Whereas the more certain fields were like stepwise kind of progression. And in those fields that were more uncertain, having someone who had worked across a large number of technology classes was like the best predictor of if you would make a breakthrough on your team. So this breadth was the ally of depth, not in zero-sum competition with it. So I think like the more creative and uncertain the problem is, or like there was a very similar study in comic books, right? These researchers were studying what caused these like blockbuster comic books, who created them. The best predictor was not the stuff that they thought would come from industrial production, resources of the publisher, years of experience, number of comics made, but the number of different genres a creator had worked across. And at low levels of genre breadth, a team of specialists did better than an individual. So at 3 genres, you were better off having 3 individuals who were genre specialists working together than one person who'd worked in 3 genres. But after 5 genres, that changed, and you're much better having this broad individual, because apparently individuals can integrate like a lot of knowledge in a way that there's process loss for a team. So these researchers called their study Superman or the Fantastic Four. If you can get a super individual who has really broad genre experience, get them. If not, like assemble a fantastic team of diverse experience. But I think what all this work suggests is that the more uncertain the path forward is,
Yeah.
the more someone with a lot of breadth like galvanizes the team.
And so you also, there were some really interesting insights about people teaching themselves things in terms of what people gained in terms of making mistakes, teaching themselves rather than that. So can you talk a little bit about that? It was especially, I think, in music and some other areas.
Yeah. And so in music, so that reminds me, so the mistakes they make when they're doing it. So one of these, one of the things that naturally I think people think of when they think of music in this topic is the Tiger Mother, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. Where on the first page of her book, she promises the secrets to raising stereotypically successful children. And the Wall Street Journal that excerpted that part of the book was their most commented upon article ever. And so she assigns one of her daughters violin there. She says she's not allowed to not play an instrument and she has to play violin. And she presides over like 3, 4, 5 hours of practice a day. And everyone remembers that. Nobody remembers, to her credit, to Amy Chua's credit, later in the book that she notes her daughter says, "You picked it, not me," and quits. Right? Nobody remembers that part of the book. But that's like what the research says, where these studies of musicians, like the most common cause of quitting is the instrument they're playing is not the one that they want to be playing. Right? And so you actually see among musicians this sampling period too. Like even people who are known as child prodigies, like Yo-Yo Ma, didn't like his first 2 instruments, so moved on. He just went through the sampling period a lot faster than most people do. But he still had that sampling period. And so it's usually, so in some of these studies, if you look at musicians who go on to become exceptional, it wasn't until their 3rd instrument that they started practicing more than students, who were deemed only average. So it's like, they aren't necessarily just practiceaholics. They find something and then it takes off. And the more improvisational the form of music, the more you see that trend. Like in the more improvisational forms, they're never doing that deliberate practice approach, right? So it's like the old jazz player joke that one guy asked the other, "Can you read music?" And the guy says, "Not enough to hurt my playing." Right? The way you learn jazz is like language. You don't do the grammar first, right? You dive in, you get an ear, and then
that was a trend too. You saw a lot of great musicians that had never learned to read music.
Huge number, and some that learned later. Even some of the greatest composers, like Duke Ellington at one point was arguably the preeminent American composer, and he was one of the few whose mother did get him some music lessons when he was a kid. His teacher was named Marietta Clinkscales. And he did it for a month and was like, "Nope, not for me. Baseball and drawing." And so he went off and did this other stuff. At like 15, he hears ragtime and comes back, opens the piano for the first time in 7 years, and says, and starts his career. And basically said, like, if I could do it when the teaching was too many rules, if I could like approach it on my own and listening and try to imitate, that was good for me. But because he never formally learned to the end of his life, he had to rely on copyists to sort of translate his shorthand into like formal notation, basically.
And can you talk about the movie? There was some movie research that was really interesting.
Oh yeah. Nobody's asked me about that. That's I guess we're in like Movie Central, so I should do that. This research. This is in the thinking using analogies for thinking a topic, and these researchers wanted to try to predict movie revenues. And they made an algorithm that took like a huge database of movies and all budgets, stars, all this other opening weekend theaters, all this stuff, and to predict revenues. And on the other side, they gave movie fans a promotional poster and like a little bit of information about the star, and these were real movies that were going to come out. And then they gave them a list of other movies and said, which of these other movies is this one most like? And they used those moviegoer predictions. They aggregated them, and the moviegoers had to like say a bunch. They had to like say which are a bunch that are the most like this one, and they used those and just used the moviegoer predictions to say like, this is what we predict the revenue will be based on what they said it's most similar to, and here's the algorithm. And the moviegoer analogies like beat the pants off the algorithm, right? And it got within like 1% and 2% on some of these movies, and one of them was like Deuce Bigalow, European Gigolo. So like, but it turned out that if they only used one of the moviegoers' analogies, they were horrible. The movie that the moviegoers said is the most like it, terrible. But if they started getting to like 6 and more, then they had this incredible predictive power where somehow the analogies we make captures this complexity that you can't get into the algorithm when it comes to prediction. Several of the predictions were like within like 4% of the total revenue of the movies, which is pretty amazing. And so, yeah, so using, and it turned out like, I think it was Netflix that eventually, they were trying to do something with an algorithm, like what are all the qualities of a movie that will make you want to see it, and realized they couldn't do it very well, and ended up just analogizing you to other viewers, which is what they do now. Instead of saying like, what do you like, it's like, who are you like? And so you can capture a lot of complexity with analogies that you can't actually get into algorithms in another way.
And so, well, final question here we'll do. So you're a new father, and I'm sure a lot of people, it's like they're looking at this and they're thinking, they've been told for how long, 10,000 hours and early expertise and everything. You know, how do you think this applies in terms of like, what should we be teaching kids now?
One of my friends jokes with me that he says, you know, he said, like, are you going to live by the stuff you say? And I'm like, no, this is just my plot to take out the competition and raise the Tiger Woods of blockchain. And whatever that even means. As soon as I figure out what it is. But no, so I think the approach that I will take, well, two things I think are important. One, we've been telling the Tiger and Mozart stories wrong. Tiger Woods, he showed extraordinary interest and prowess that his father reacted to. As he has said, my father never asked me to play golf, not once. It's always me asking him. Mozart, right? I went through these letters, and you'd see like a letter where a musician had visited the house to play with his father. A group of musicians recounts Mozart coming in and saying, I want to play second violin. And his dad's like, you haven't taken any lessons, get out of here, you can't play. And he starts crying. And this musician says, well, I'll go in the next room and play with him just to calm him down. And next thing you know, they're hearing second violin coming from that room. And so the letter says, this part I remember verbatim, says, little Wolfgang was emboldened by our applause to insist that he could also play the first violin. Right? And so then he plays the first violin with this made-up fingering and all this stuff. And then his father facilitates tons of opportunity and practice. But in both cases, the fathers were reacting to these incredibly unusual displays. So one, they weren't manufactured first, right? They were facilitated after they showed that. And your best chance of getting that is exposing the kid to a bunch of stuff and seeing if one of those things takes off.
Exactly.
Right? I'm sure there were other potential Tigers and Mozarts, but they didn't encounter those. You know, it's like a Usain Bolt. Like if he's born anywhere but Jamaica, the Bahamas, or Trinidad, like he's not a sprinter, period. And secondly, I think my role as a father is like the talent-based branching coach in the Army, to make a bunch of opportunities available, and then as my son tries them, help him reflect on those so that he can get the maximum amount of learning about himself from each one. So I view my role as being the coach in the talent-based branching process. Make a bunch of stuff available, try to help him get the best signal from each one of those. But you know, the fact is, I also have no desire to live vicariously through him, so I'm not worried about becoming a sports parent either.
So you're gonna give the big sampling period so that he can respond. You can catch his response, and then from there, you know, it's
and I'll try to help him like learn the best lessons he can from those things.
So then that's the reflection.
All right. Let's open it up to questions.
Okay, it is that time of the evening. Just a quick reminder, around here, questions typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. We do not believe in two-part questions. And tonight, only Eric gets to ask follow-up questions. So with those rules in place, who would like to go first?
Hi, thank you so much. This was so interesting.
Thank you.
If you believe yourself not to be a natural self-regulatory learner, have you come across any, anecdotes or stories of ways that people have built those habits of reflection and things like that, and what are your tips for doing that?
Yeah, so, and again, I'm stealing from Mariah L. Frank Gemser's work here, but she would basically give like questions that people had to fill out whenever they did something, and all those questions, they were specific to the domain she was looking in, but they all amounted to just like forcing the person to constantly be tracking, like, how did I feel about this? Like, did I learn anything? Is this exactly what I expected it would be? Things like that. Like, is there anything I might be learning that I didn't expect, or that's harder or easier for me than I would have expected? And so, if it really doesn't come naturally to people, a lot of the questions you suggested were things about like your expectations going in, so that you alert yourself to like, well, I am learning stuff about myself that's different than expectations. For me, it's I keep this, what I call my little book of experiments. It's got an Alice in Wonderland cover on it. It says curiouser and curiouser. And so, yeah, I think it's a habit you can develop for sure. If it doesn't, and that's like everything, it just comes naturally to some. The people she was studying were largely people that it came naturally to. And then she started helping systems with it. And she would say that things like school is oriented poorly for self-regulatory learners a lot of times because there's such a long delay between like when they take a test and they get any feedback about it, and they like want to like learn how they're doing at things, and so it'd be better if they could get that feedback sooner. Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
Did you notice anything with the impact of technology, with the thought that so much of our technology has the procedural and deep knowledge? Is there anything that shows that that is driving us more towards being generalists?
That's like the thesis of my first chapter.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know how much I should like answer that question if book comes out. Basically it's like that the things that are the most automatable are these things, these kind world things that are very amenable to specialization, like chess, which is the grandmaster's advantage is based on pattern recognition, but computers are better at that. And so that's not the field you really want to be in. But when Gary Kasparov lost to Deep Blue, and I have the vintage Newsweek written the brain's last stand. Apparently not. We're still contributing. And what he noticed in that game was something called Moravic's paradox, that humans and computers often have opposite strengths and weaknesses. The computer was extremely good at tactics, which is basically pattern recognition, essentially. Not as good at strategy, which is this bigger picture thinking, but most of, like 99% of chess is tactics. The pattern recognition, what you study for years and years and years, and you have to specialize early in chess. So if you haven't started studying patterns by the age of 12, your chances of reaching international master status drop from like 1 in 4 to 1 in 55. So you have to specialize early there. And so Kasparov started promoting these competitions where humans could play with computers, and called freestyle chess. And the winners of the first tournament were neither grandmasters nor computers, nor grandmasters with computers, but were a pair of amateurs with a couple laptops. And it turned out that they were like, moderate amateur players. They knew something about computers, they knew something about chess, and they were the best at sort of integrating this streaming information and telling the computers where else to look and making decisions. All of the stuff that the grandmasters spent all those years studying was outsourced to the computer, and this big picture thinking became what was important. And the more, even in like challenges of games where computers move toward these more open-ended games, like one called StarCraft, which actually Google's DeepMind just beat a pro in StarCraft, but if you actually watch the game, they had to alter the game so that the computer could see the entire map and the human player couldn't. And that's part of the game, is like the spying. And so when they were put on the same footing, the human won. And this is a game that's less predictable than chess. You have to integrate. The humans are not that good at any particular thing. You have to explore, you have to fight, you have to like build stuff and spy and all this stuff. The computer's way better at things like shooting accuracy, of course. And the humans aren't super great at any particular thing, but it's our ability to sort of coordinate these things and have them move in tandem that is apparently we're quite good at. So the more you move toward the big picture strategy stuff, the more advantage we have over computers. Those human-computer teams are called centaurs, by the way. So I think a lot of the things that previously required specialization are the things that are most quickly automated. And you can see this in some jobs. This isn't in the book, but this scholar named James Besson writes about it a lot, where things like the ATM was supposed to get rid of the job of bank teller. And in fact, it didn't. Since ATMs, we have more bank tellers because branches became cheaper, so banks opened more branches, and so they have more tellers, even though there are fewer tellers per branch. But it completely changed the job from one of these repetitive transactions to someone who's like all soft skills, marketing, customer service, all this kind of stuff. So it totally changed the job to these broader kinds of skills. Yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions. Hi there. I was wondering what you think is a career trajectory format that would allow for maximizing a productive experimentation process in your career. So currently or previously, there's kind of a stigma of leaving a job too early.
Yeah.
But it would seem to me that if you want to maximize experimentation, you would do, like 6-month stints at a whole bunch of jobs for a while at a certain period in your career to learn as much as possible.
Yeah.
And before you focus, maybe a series of internships post-college or something like that. So practically speaking, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on what this should look like going forward into the future.
Yeah, what you're talking about is exactly what the Army did with talent-based branching, right? They said, we're going to let you try some careers for a couple months, but the Army can control a large pipeline, and so they can systematically do that in an easier way. But I talk about an economist in the book who models ideal search for match quality, and he models it as what's called a multi-arm bandit process. So one-arm bandit is slang for a slot machine, right? 'Cause you pull the one arm and it steals money from you. And a multi-arm bandit process comes from this conceptual problem where, say that every choice someone has to make about how to spend their time is like a pull of the lever, and you have a person sitting in front of a bunch of slot machines, and they can pull the levers and start to get a sense of what kind of reward they can get with what frequency, and how do they figure out how to like allot their pulls across these different potential options. And he modeled career matching in that same way and found that it's a really good fit, and what you should do is you should go to like the high risk, high reward things that get big signal early. So ideally, you would go into fields where you get a big signal about your interest and fit first, right? So young and dumb, like going into these high risk careers that young people do is super smart. You should dive into those high risk, high reward things where you get a big signal first. But I would love to see more options to do that. So one thing I cut out of the book was about these things called career academies that are for kids who are not going to college probably, where they get the normal high school curriculum, but they also get exposure to a certain line of work through internships and other types of exposure. And it turns out that even if they go into something that has nothing to do with that part of the training, they end up having higher income than their matched peers. And that some of that seems to be that they start like learning about their skills and interests in the work world, and also they have some positive interactions with adults. And so I think it would be great if we could systematize more of that and say, like, we have this economist who showed in this really cool experiment that the late specializers in college have an advantage. So let's facilitate that being like part of the process instead of something that people have to do in spite of the process. But I think a lot of things, there are a lot of forces working against that.
And our final question for the evening.
You approach this topic from one perspective of the individual wanting to either be specialist or generalized or so forth, but the other aspect or the other side of it is where my question lies is, with all this data and with everything you've said in the book and so forth, everybody in this room would agree, hey, it sounds like it's best to be a generalist, right? But at the end of the day, it seems as if the rest of society, in the sense of employment and things of that nature, don't actually agree with your thesis. And so the question I have is why do you think that is? Is that ignorance? Is that the self-preservation? Is that a number of other reasons? Is why is something so obvious to everybody in the room not actually executed when it comes from an employment or hiring perspective or just out in the world, right? Because at the end of the day, everybody trains to be a specialist.
Yeah. Well,
so what do you think that is?
Or everyone's told to be a specialist, right? And again, I do think we need specialists also. But I also think that there is some cultural lag with people feeling like they're being told to be specialists. So like when LinkedIn did research on 500,000 members, because they have these incredible databases, they found that one of the best predictors of who would become an executive was the number of different job functions they had worked across within an industry. So each additional job function saved them about 3 years of experience en route to the C-suite, right? So clearly people were recognizing them and willing to make them executives. So I think it's always this short-term advice. I think there are actually a lot of people in powerful positions that do value that broad experience, but when you're asked for the momentary advice, it's never to like, go experiment and be broad, right? Right, when I'm working as a science grad student, I'm like, okay, this geology grad school, that's a sunk cost, okay? Then I get over to Sports Illustrated as a temp fact checker in my late 20s, and there's 1 million people in line to be the next baseball or football beat reporter, and suddenly my very ordinary science skills become totally extraordinary at a sports magazine, and I fly past everyone as a temp fact checker, become a senior writer, right? Because I had these goofy skills where I'm not competing in zero-sum competition with anybody. I'm just like on my own ground, and if I can be good. But and yet, when college students would contact me and say, I want to work at Sports Illustrated, should I major in journalism or English? My first instinct was to say journalism. Of course, like you're trying to be a journalist. My second instinct was to say English. And my third instinct was to say, I have no idea. I majored in geology and astronomy. I don't know what to tell you. And so I think it's just difficult to give that advice, because, again, one of the themes of the book is that the way to get the best short-term improvement is often not the way to get the best long-term development. And the reason I start with sports is because we now know the way to develop the best 10-year-old athlete is not the same as the way to develop the best 20-year-old athlete. But when people are held accountable for just like short-term metrics, like they're going to respond to their incentives. And so while I think there is sort of some change happening because people are recognizing how rapidly the work world is changing, and that if you're too specialized and rigid, you won't be able to adapt. But there's a lot of work to do. I mean, and again, sports is an area where there's been, in some countries, actually quite good recognition of this. Not in this one. HBO Real Sports just had a great special about Norway, which like exploded the Winter Olympics. They've like banned formal competition before age 12, essentially. And they're like arguably the best sporting nation in the world right now. But I think it's going to take time. I hope I add like a little bit of fodder to this discussion, but it's going to take a lot more than that, unfortunately. And what you're saying is exactly what the Tillman Foundation scholars were saying to me, right? People are telling us like we don't have the right linear experience. So I don't know how to change that overnight. I don't think it does, but I hope I'm doing like a little part of that. And I'll keep bitching at people who have power about it. That's the best I can offer.
Well, thanks, Eric. Thank you, David.
Thank you.